What is Service Fabric? Welcome back to the Hello World Show. I'm Heather Downing.
And I'm Spencer Schneidenbach. We're here at NDC Oslo with K. Scott Allen, just Scott Allen, but I say K because it sounds so regal. He's the owner of Ode to Code. He is a prolific Pluralsight author and a consultant, and we're so glad to have you. Tell us a little more about yourself.
Thank you. I live in Western Maryland, so East Coast of the United States, and this all started, I got into software development when I was 12, and my parents brought home a Texas Instruments computer. And once I got bored with the games that were on it, I found this thing called BASIC and eventually assembly language programming, and it's been all software since then.
Awesome.
Oh, that's awesome. So what keeps you continuing to be passionate about what you do?
I keep trying to learn new things, so once I feel like I've gotten my fill of a particular topic and that I have some sort of mastery with it, which doesn't always happen, but then I'll move on to new things. So for example, this year I made a lot of the work I've been doing lately has started to move more and more towards the cloud, so I made a dedicated effort starting on January 1st to just start focusing on back-end stuff and cloud stuff this year and learning everything I can about everything from networking in the cloud to machine learning, and anything that you could find in AWS, Azure, Google. I've tried to at least learn a little bit about.
That's wonderful. So what do you look for in a beginner developer? How can you tell the greats when they start, or can you?
Oh, yeah, that's a tough one. Over the years I've sat in a lot of interviews, and there's one company that I've worked with for a number of years, and there's always something special about. Sorry, maybe you can edit that part out.
We got this.
Yeah. Some of the developers that I've found that have worked out the best just have a natural curiosity to try to figure out how something is done. They don't want to copy and paste code. They want to actually figure out how this thing's working behind the scenes. And one of the funny things that I've found is that a lot of developers who have very successful careers have had some sort of meta-programming in their college experience. So something like a Lisp type language where it's just a little more abstract than something like a C# or a C++, but it gives you that extra ability and insight into how software works.
All right, Scott, great to have you.
Thank you.
What would you like to teach us today?
I would like to talk about Service Fabric, which I have been experimenting with over the last few months.
What is this concept of Service Fabric?
Service Fabric is a technology that evolved out of Microsoft. So when Microsoft was actually building Microsoft Azure, they needed a technology that had a few special characteristics to be able to run in the cloud and be resilient and be able to manage resources across multiple machines. Basically, a framework for building distributed applications. So internally, they had this, I don't know if it was called Service Fabric at the time, but internally they were using this framework and building out things like Azure SQL was actually built on top of this technology. CosmoDB, which used to be known as DocumentDB, was built on this technology. But then they packaged things up and they now make it available for developers to use anywhere, and it's not tied to Azure. I could use Service Fabric and install it on laptops in my basement and have a cluster to run a distributed application on any hardware anywhere.
And that's what Azure uses for its core infrastructure.
I can't remember the exact statistic, but I've heard, I believe it was at least 30% of the CPU cores inside of Azure are running some type of technology that runs on Service Fabric. So it's a significant amount.
Right on.
So it's in production, it's reliable, it allows you to monitor things, it keeps services up and running, and you can now build your own applications on top of the same technology.
So what else are you going to teach us about it?
Okay. Well, we can look at, so there's two perspectives from Service Fabric. The first perspective, I think, is the runtime perspective. That is, when I deploy my services and application to Service Fabric, what does that actually look like on the hardware? And so what Service Fabric is, you can think of Service Fabric being in the middle of this cluster of nodes. So each node is a virtual machine, which again could be inside of Azure or in your data center or in your basement, wherever you want to set these nodes up. Node 1, Node 2, Node 3, Node 4. 5 is the recommended minimum for production. But what Service Fabric will do is all these nodes are now sort of interconnected. And when I deploy my application, I might deploy pieces of my application as individual services. So one piece of that application might actually just be the web UI. So it could be an ASP.NET project, ASP.NET Core. You can also implement things in Node and Java and Ruby. You can use various technologies. But what I would do, so let's say I'm building a movie store application, some sort of storefront. I might decompose my application so there's the UI piece. The UI piece, when a user comes in to make a payment or place an order, it actually needs to make calls into another service that handles payments. There might be another service out here for, let's say, identity and authorization. You know, you could dream up an architecture for an application. But the key point I'm trying to get to here is that there's 3 services. There's an XML file that I use to describe my application and all the services inside the Service Fabric. So I give Service Fabric the XML file, the manifest. I give Service Fabric a package that contains all of the executable code. And I just describe how I want this distributed on this set of nodes. So Service Fabric can take that information and say, okay, we're going to spin up the web UI and run it on all nodes in the cluster. So the web UI is on every single machine, and that just means that if this machine dies, there's a power failure, there's a network problem between the two, that's okay because there's other nodes that are still out there that are up and running. Some of these services can be stateful services, and this is kind of where we flip over from the runtime model of having all these nodes in a cluster, and there's a management interface where I can log in and see what nodes I have available. There's also a programming model. So in the programming model, I can just take a dependency on a Service Fabric SDK, which actually gives me things like in C# base classes that I can inherit from, and I can tell Service Fabric I have a stateless service, which is typically the web UI is stateless and it can run on any node. And that doesn't mean that it doesn't use any state. You could still store state in SQL Server or any database. But I can also write what's known as stateful services in Service Fabric, and this is where things get really interesting because a stateful service in Service Fabric, the state, you actually get collections like a dictionary collection and a queue collection that are reliable, persisted collections. So I can tell Service Fabric, for instance, maybe my payment service, when a user is maybe building up a shopping cart, maybe I'm actually storing that state in the service, and I can tell Service Fabric, I need to run this service in the Fabric, and Service Fabric will set up a payment service, let's say on this node, and then for every primary replica of that stateful service, it'll set up some secondaries with copies of the state. Again, if this node fails, and this is the primary payment service, PP, if that node goes offline, Service Fabric will detect that and say, oh, well, let's just go to the secondary one, promote it to be the new primary. It still contains all the state you need. Nothing's gone down, I haven't lost anything. And that's just the core of Service Fabric. There's a programming model and there's a runtime to make sure you're up and running, you don't lose state. It's good. And it's proven, too. So they're actually running all these things in Azure based on that stuff.
So it's just it's as simple as like going in and using a Service Fabric library, inheriting from an interface, and then using. I'm guessing there's different kinds of services. You said like stateful,
right?
Non-stateful.
Right.
And then you get and then it's distributed to Service Fabric, which just gives you redundancy and resiliency.
Right.
So you get the best of lots of worlds. You get the
right.
simplicity, but you get a lot of power from scale. That way you don't have to worry about. No
exactly.
fails.
And again, the end goal is I want to be able to write an application that lives in this environment that's reliable and resilient. So if things fail, like an entire machine goes offline, everything stays up and running. That's the end goal. And as part of that also, I need the ability to scale. So on a Sunday afternoon, no one's using the thing, maybe I only have a 5-node cluster. But then Monday morning at 9 a.m., maybe this is a business application, 10,000 people start logging in, this can scale out pretty quickly to 100 or 1,000 nodes. And Service Fabric will just distribute things so everything keeps running.
Can you run Service Fabric on other hosts besides Azure?
Yeah, so what's neat about Service Fabric in Azure is if you go into the Azure portal, there's actually a resource you can create a service fabric cluster, right? You click on that and it'll walk you through the configuration that you need to set up Service Fabric in Azure. But all it's really doing is provisioning virtual machines and putting them into an Azure virtual machine scale set and installing Service Fabric runtime on there for you. But you could do the same thing in Azure, or in Amazon, or anywhere where you can get to hardware. You could do all that setup yourself. It's just Azure's going to make it a little bit easier since it is a Microsoft product and a Microsoft cloud, right?
And you know it's got to be good because not only do they have it available as a service, but they dog food. They use it themselves.
They definitely dog food it, yes.
Yeah.
And they continue to improve it. One of the most recent things is you can now, if you containerize your application, so you're building something like with Docker containers, and you put stuff in containers, you can hand off containers to Service Fabric and basically say, here's a container, here's how I want to run it, and it'll take care of putting it out there on the nodes and making sure it stays up and running. And updates. I mean, so there's all sorts of things going in Service Fabric. There's, I want to update my application. Service Fabric will make sure that it doesn't tear everything down and replace all those bits. You know, it's going to update piecemeal so that things stay up and running. Again, it's all about high availability basically with Service Fabric.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for sharing
Yes, thank
this
you very
with
much.
us. I learned quite a bit, actually.
Yeah, me too.
Thank you.
Cool.
It was nice to be here.
Don't forget to share this video on social media.
And comment below to be entered into our weekly giveaway.
Tell us what questions you have for our guests. See you next time.